first slide, which perhaps isn't as enigmatic as it may seem at first hand, but I think you'll probably come to understand it once I've gone through the lecture. Now, as in Europe, China developed a hierarchy in the arts. At the apex is calligraphy, followed very closely by painting. This hierarchy began to develop in China very early on, in fact, about the 4th century AD, when works of two major artists, one a calligrapher, Wang Shizhe, and the painter Gu Kaizhe, their work started to be discussed and appreciated in a more systematic way. And this period, around about the 4th, 5th century AD, this marks the beginning of the art historical canon in China. This canon was gradually but systematically built up by the so-called scholar official or literati class, the highly educated and politically powerful class in China who traditionally peopled the bureaucracy. They formed a continuity throughout the dynasties, a bit like our civil service, I suppose, in the UK, maintaining their cohesiveness by their Confucian ideals, which were the basis of the imperial dynasties. And of course, under the Confucian ideal, anyone through the right education could become a gentleman and an official. So the status of a scholar official became the ambition of most Chinese men, and I do emphasize men, unfortunately. So it should not be surprising then that Chinese culture, and I'm talking about high culture, and scholar official culture should become one and the same. And what differentiated them from the rest of humanity was their skill in writing. And of course, writing was the essential ticket of admission to that class. Basically, calligraphy became an art because those who wielded the brush deemed this skill the highest art form and built up a whole network of aesthetics to reinforce the position. And by extension, painting followed calligraphy as the next major art form because the same skill in wielding the brush was required. And I'll say a bit more about the brush in a moment, because having a brush rather than, say, a pen is part of the whole process that brings a whole new dynamic to the art form, gives a huge amount of flexibility and creativity. And to reinforce the rarefied atmosphere of calligraphy and painting, and to ensure that the work of this scholar class remained exclusive, a whole vocabulary of aesthetics, ideas, artistic values were built up, so that their activities could be measured, assessed, and of course mystified. And I suppose it's worth saying at this stage that unlike in the West, where you had a professional class of artists, in China, the power or the importance remained with the amateur, the scholar amateur, not the professional artist. You did have professionals, but they were paid artisans. Scholar officials painted because they wanted to paint, and they painted because they were under some kind of personal conviction to produce a work of art. That's the theory. So they weren't paid, theoretically, they created because they wanted to create. And so it was believed that good calligraphy and painting contained balance. It documented the inequalities of the executor and contained a spirit that was real and tangible. A piece of calligraphy might be seen as a direct link with the artist, even though he might be 1,000 miles away or even long dead. The result was that calligraphy was considered to reveal the inequalities of a true scholar gentleman, whose balance and morality, it was believed, was embodied in his work. And I quote a scholar who's done quite a bit of work on calligraphy in particular, the Lothar Lederosa, and he says, and I quote, "Chinese calligraphy is the only major art form in the world that allows the viewer to retrace the creation of a finished work in all its consecutive phases. Within each character, the sequence of strokes follows established rules that do not change. The characters follow one beneath the other, and the lines follow each other from right to left. Because the Chinese calligrapher is always required to produce a readable text and must strictly adhere to a certain sequence of strokes, the viewer can follow with his eye the exact movements of the brush through the strokes, the characters and the lines from beginning to end. He feels the rhythm in the writer's hand, his dexterity and his sensitivity. He relishes whether the writer put down the brush gracefully or forcefully, whether he lifted it rapidly or slowly." And this is particularly the case, I think, with some of the more fluid styles of calligraphy that enable the writer to imbue the work with greater virtuosity. And I've got a slide here of Zhu Yunming's The Sounds of Autumn. And it's in something called Xingshu, which is a running script. It's like a joined up handwriting. It allows the calligrapher to do rapid strokes without really lifting the brush. But, and it's the whole writing, the whole way in which the piece has been done is expressive of the content of the text, because, as I said before, the text also has to be readable. It's an artistic creation. It looks wonderful as a work of art, but it has to be a text that can be deciphered and read. And the sounds, and part of the, because it's a poem, of course, the Sounds of Autumn, it's a poem by Liang Xu, which is rendered in calligraphy in a particular style by Zhu Yunming, that he's also trying to create the essence of the text within his own work of art. So having a brush and different sizes of brush and having different qualities of ink, which are made, of course, just prior to starting on the work, it gives a huge amount of variety and possibility to the finished text. But it's all built up really from a particular formula, and the strokes have, as you students will know, has a particular order, stroke order, top to bottom and left to right. And you have to follow that stroke order. So even though a calligrapher, as in the previous piece, would be doing things rapidly, he would still be following that stroke like that, up and down. But it'd be done so quickly, and with his own sort of knowledge of past styles of calligraphy, that it just gets joined up and is part of that whole revealing the inequality of the work. And the balance of each character and spacing, you see, a number of characters written together determine an overall composition of the work too. So you're allowed great freedom, but you have to follow stroke order, and you have to follow a particular, it's almost like filling a square, and it has to balance out in terms of the overall composition. And of course, the flexibility of the brush allows every detail of the movement of the calligrapher to be carefully observed, especially with the cursive scripts, where the brush rarely leaves the paper on the silk. And that's why I said that you can follow the process from beginning to end. Because in a work, as we saw previously, like this, you could follow the whole process, the whole stroke order in some detail. So it's as if you're looking over the shoulder of the artist, even though that artist might be long dead or miles away. Now these calligraphy and the cursive scripts, the running scripts, didn't develop in the realms of officialdom. And I said at the beginning that the scholar literati class developed calligraphy, but they didn't develop it within the domain of their official work. And I put some of these early bronzes and jades up because it was in the context of bronzes in particular, bronze casting, that the script developed. And some of the early script were part of the cast inscriptions, which were cast into these ritual bronzes. So, so you don't get the same fluidity in this early form of writing, about 2,000 years BC. And you also get writing in this sense developing within the realm of officialdom, because bronzes like this were part of the wealth and status of the individual who owned them. And many of the texts relate to ownership in clans and particular political events. So writing, of course, was an important way of communicating within China, particularly the written script. And in a sense, writing developed in the realm of officialdom. But writing in terms of calligraphy and personal expression developed within the context of leisure time. And that was another important part of the scholar official, that he had official work to do, but he also had leisure time, spare time, to cultivate the inner qualities of the individual. And that's where calligraphy as an art form develops. And it develops within things like poetry, personal exchanges like letters, in particular, things which on the face of it look fairly insignificant, but actually it's where the personality can be expressed within the text. So that's where, ironically, it develops within personal ways of expression, not within officialdom, even though the language developed in that context. And just to illustrate the point, I've got a few famous personages that are usually seen within the context of writing or painting. And just on the far left, of course, is Confucius there, but more up to date is Mao Zedong. And of course, in the title page of the People's Daily was the calligraphy of Mao Zedong, because he came from that scholar tradition. And here he is, photograph. What's he doing? He's executing a piece of calligraphy or painting. So he's following, even though it's you're thinking of a revolution and the downfall of the imperial dynasties, he's still following this important tradition. In the middle, we've got the Emperor Qianlong, famous emperor in the 18th century in China, known for his scholarship, known as a great poet, well, not great poet, but as a poet, great collector, connoisseur. And here he is in his leisure time, scholar's dress, and here he is about to execute a painting or a piece of calligraphy. His grandfather, Kangxi Emperor, in the same context of large brush in hand, paper at the ready. And at the top, although we don't have someone writing, for the Emperor Huizong from the Song dynasty, he's in this bucolic garden, and very often the garden setting isn't far away from these activities. And he's playing the guqin, or it's like a zither, which is associated with scholarly attributes. So you get the sense of this artistic activity going on within the realm of private self-cultivation. And here, this is the sort of ideal of a scholar's desk, where you've got the accoutrements that will be conducive to producing a work of art. So obviously, here we've got a text already that is annotated in the ready. You've got the brush here, which is a jade brush. Brush rests to rest the wrist while you're executing your work. Here we have an ink stone, because the ink, you can see some red ink here, is a solid piece of ink, and you mix it with water from the water pot here, pour in the water, start to grind your ink, and you prepare yourself for the execution of the work. And then a rather nice jade brush holder here for your different brushes. So you've got all the accoutrements really, and accoutrements of huge value and quality to help you get into the mindset of producing the work. So cursive scripts develop, as I say, not in the realm of official documents, but more in the realm of the intimate note, the private letter, and the poem. And as I said, in the context of leisure activity, and a good example is the calligraphy of the 4th century calligrapher, the first renowned calligrapher, if you like, Wang Shizhe. Wang Shizhe's most famous piece of calligraphy on the screen here is Lan Ting Shu, the preface written at the Orchid Pavilion Gathering. And it's a particular gathering of scholars in 353 AD. And it was written at a literary gathering of friends in a garden to celebrate the annual Spring Purification Festival. According to tradition, scholars would congregate on the 3rd day of the 3rd moon every spring to bathe, sing, drink, and drinks an important part of creation, particularly drinking wine, relax, within a sort of garden setting. Customarily, the scholars played a special drinking and poetry game. And I'll just show you, this is a later painting illustrating this so-called gathering. Should do a nice magical work. So it's a scroll painting. And what would happen is that servants would fill small wine cups and then set them afloat along the river on leaves. The scholars who could not compose a suitable verse on the spot had to take a cup from the stream and drink before rejoining the game. I mean, it's almost an incentive not to get your verse right, to have a forfeit. 41 scholars took part in the festivities. Men of similar education and unified philosophy, who, of course, had the necessary qualities of judging calligraphy and indeed writing it. And really, these elements, with the fact that Wang Shizhe was one of the earliest exponents of calligraphy and also patronized by the imperial court, established him as one of the first in the canon of Chinese art history. Many of the ideas that surrounded calligraphy also gradually began to inform how painting was viewed and executed. And as early as the 6th century AD, theoretician Qie He laid down the 6 laws of painting. First law being spirit resonance, the revelation of the inequalities and the animation, really, of a subject. So not to capture an external object or event, but really to create the inner spirit of the work. And the second law too, the bone method, that's used part of the brush. It's about the method of using the brush creatively. And really, it's only when you get a bit further down in the laws that you start getting a correspondence with the object, or the suitability to type, and planning and transmission. But the 2 top laws are to do with this spiritual aspect of the work and its execution with the brush. The conceptualization of painting took a further step during the 11th century, when a group of literati led by poet, politician and artist, Su Shi, began to separate their art from professional artists who painted for a living, and they were seen by Su Shi and his new group as mere technicians and able to transmit the inequalities necessary as a true work of art. Suchet wrote, and I quote, "The artisans of the world may be able to create the forms perfectly, but when it comes to the principles, unless one is a superior man of outstanding talent, one cannot achieve them." And of course, they don't mean outstanding talent in painting, they mean an outstanding talent in executing a brush, which is a totally different thing. Suchet and his friends saw painting as a vehicle for expression, independent of its subject matter. And that really doesn't come into Western art theory until the 20th century. Conceptual art, in other words. The subject of a painting was often symbolic of a much more complex idea or set of ideas. And the medium, ink on paper, was also that used in writing and expressing ideas. The connection with calligraphy was explicit. Suchet wrote, and I quote, "From ancient times on, painters have not been common men. Their excellent visualizations of reality are produced in the same way as poetry." In other words, literati painters were using the forms and conventions of the written word, the painting having the minimal number of strokes and often executed only in ink, without additional colours to achieve their aim. An example here of Suchet's work, but also here a work of his cousin Wan Tong, and I'll come back to him in a moment. And these scholar gentlemen maintained that good painting could not be imitated because it was the expression of the thoughts and feelings of an individual, and the painting was unique to that individual. With this intensely personal attitude, there went a new detachment from things. Suchet spoke not of concentrated and intensive study, but merely of borrowing the forms of rocks, mountains, and trees to give lodging for the moment to his feelings. The bamboo, and we've got an example here, symbolic of the attributes of the scholar class, was thought a suitable subject to embody these thoughts. And, I mean, it's symbolic in the sense that the bamboo was associated with qualities of the scholar, like the fact it was evergreen, it never faded, it bent but didn't break. It, all these sorts of qualities which were imbued within the tree. Such paintings represented the thoughts and expressions of the Confucian gentleman, an in-group who believed their work could only be representative of inner vision, symbolic of the scholar himself and his unbreakable spirit. So Wan Tong then was an older cousin of Suchet's, but part of this same group and mindset. He was a poet as well as a painter, and eulogized his paintings in ink of bamboo. His rapid calligraphic brushstroke is a deliberate reference to calligraphic strokes, and again, bamboo, because of the nature of it, it's almost like writing characters rather than representing an image. The combination, too, of a poetic text with painting, and you can see the poem at the top, was another scholarly reference tying in the close symbiotic relationship of the two arts. Metaphors like this were central to scholar or one-run painting. In a colophon to a painting by Wang Tingyun, another literatus, Tang Hu wrote, and I quote, "Set forth your heart without reserve, and your brush will be inspired. Writing and painting serve a single aim, the revelation of innate goodness. Here are two companions, an old tree and tall bamboo, metamorphosed by his unreined hand, finished in an instant. The embodiment of a single moment is the treasure of 100 ages, and one feels, unrolling it, a fondness as if seeing the man himself. And you see all those references to the person. You're gazing on this painting and you're gazing and almost communicating with the artist who created it. And the embodiment of a single moment, it's not this measured, thoughtful planning of a work, but it's this quick execution as part of the inspiration of the moment. Not necessarily what happened, but this is the ideal situation. And it reiterates the idea that viewing a painting means that one can communicate with the artist and understand his thoughts, even though many generations have passed. And it has this idea, again, of presence. And I suppose the other thing I want to say about calligraphy and indeed painting is you often get, it's almost like a work in progress, that you start with a painting or a piece of calligraphy, but then it grows. That's the start of the work. But if it's a fine piece of work and people appreciate it becomes then a collector's item. It becomes something which is a treasure passed on to different generations. And this is another famous piece of calligraphy by Wang Shijie, and it's called Feng Du Tie. It's literally a series of letters about gifting oranges to a friend. So it's this informal communications. But what it does display, of course, is the personal writing of the calligrapher Wang Shijie. Now what you'll see is the heart is the text. And sort of in the middle of this scroll is the original text. And I won't go into the fact that this probably isn't the 4th century original. It's probably something like a 7th or 8th century copy. Nevertheless, it's an early, probably the earliest surviving example of this calligraphy. And what's happened over the generations is that it's gone into private collections, it's gone into imperial collections, and every time it's viewed or appreciated, someone has added a colophon or commentary to the work. And of course, as you can see, they've also added their own personal seals. And that's what you often get with works. It's not just the original piece, it's all the accumulated provenance, if you like, of those who have owned it and appreciated it. And of course, because it's Wang Shijie's calligraphy, it entered and re-entered imperial collections, literally from its creation right down to the last emperor in, as you can see, right at the very top there, top right-hand corner, the seal of the emperor, Chuan 1908 to 1911. So this is right on the end there. This is now in the National Palace Museum in Taipei. It's now a museum piece. So there's no addition. That's where the work of art stops. That's where the act of creation stops, because it's now a museum object. But really in 1911, up until 1911, it was still in the process of creation and recreation. And you might think, well, doesn't this detract? If you had a Rembrandt and you started to write on it and add your own commentary, you might lessen the value and the quality of the work. Not in the context of Chinese works of art, because those, of course, who owned it and who collected it were of that high status. They're part of that same scholarly tradition. So you've got emperors, you've got important collectors, people who were known within a particular period for their connoisseursship and appreciation of calligraphy. And this isn't a one-off process. You'll see, this is another famous painting by Kangan, Tang Dynasty painter, and he did a series of these horses. And you can see the swathe of commentary and seals that almost, encroach on the image of the horse itself. And it just shows, again, you're looking at the names. Southern Tang Emperor is number 1 here. If you can find it up there at the top. Li Fu, famous painter and calligrapher of the Northern Song dynasty. You've got many people who would be recognized. Chen Long, who we saw at the very beginning, his seal, which will be one of the biggest because he tends to have centre stage, he's over number 12. And these are all really reinforcing the quality and the importance of the work. It's not detracting from it, it goes the other way, it reinforces that quality. So those are the seals, and then we have one showing the colophons or inscription. Now we've got a similar array of big names, Chenlong, Southern Tang Emperor, Yu, and so forth. And but this is all part of the tradition, and really they're using the same materials, they're using the same style of calligraphy in many ways, or they're certainly using the same stroke order. It's all part of a continuing tradition. And if it's a good piece of calligraphy, of course, then it brings not only a text, a readable text, which is commenting on the work, but it also brings the in-expression of that person who executed it. So that's probably all I want to say. But we'll give you, I hope it's given you a sort of flavour of really the importance of calligraphy and then painting within the fine art tradition in China, and why really calligraphy and painting are really at the top, the apex of the artistic tradition. Thank you.